Chapter 1: An Urgent Summons to Lisbon. The autumn of '93 had settled upon London with a peculiarly relentless dampness, cloaking the city in a perpetual shroud of grey mist and a chill that seeped into the very bones. For some weeks, life at 221B Baker Street had proceeded with an almost unnatural tranquility, a state of affairs that, while perhaps welcome to a man of more domestic inclinations, invariably portended a storm for the restless spirit of Sherlock Holmes. He had, as was his custom during such barren periods of crime, retreated into the labyrinthine corridors of his own mind, emerging only for the most pungent of chemical experiments in his makeshift laboratory or to pore over obscure monographs on forensic pathology or the esoteric dialects of ancient criminal argot. My own time was largely occupied with my medical practice, the writing of these chronicles, and a mild, though ultimately futile, attempt to encourage Holmes towards a more regular and less hazardous regimen of diet and sleep. It was during one such typically dreary afternoon, as the gas lamps were already struggling against the encroaching gloom and the air within our sitting room grew thick with the acrid scent of some new reagent, that the sharp ring of the downstairs bell broke the monotonous hum of the London street. Mrs. Hudson's heavy footsteps preceded a knock at our door, and she entered bearing a telegram, its foreign script and multiple stamps immediately catching my eye. "For you, Mr. Holmes," she announced, her tone reflecting the usual mild perturbation that any interruption caused in our peculiar household. Holmes, whose gaunt figure had been hunched over a retort, stirring a cloudy liquid with a glass rod, straightened up with an alacrity that belied his previous absorption. He plucked the missive from Mrs. Hudson's hand, his keen eye scanning the header. "Ah, Watson," he observed, tearing open the envelope with a deft movement, "it appears the languor of late May at last be broken. From Lisbon, no less." I watched him, accustomed to the subtle changes in his demeanor that heralded the scent of a new problem. His brow, initially furrowed in concentration on his experiment, smoothed out, and a faint, almost imperceptible gleam entered his eyes. He read the telegram quickly, then reread it, a sardonic smile playing about his lips. "Listen to this, Watson," he said, handing me the crumpled sheet. My eyes fell upon the formal, yet desperate, prose. "Urgent. Sherlock Holmes. Baker Street, London. Implore your immediate assistance. Calamity of impossible nature befallen Palacio de Estrella. Priceless artifact vanished without trace. Local authorities baffled. Need your unique gifts. Expenses no object. Lord Eduardo de Braganca. Lisbon. Impossible nature," I read aloud, my voice tinged with my characteristic skepticism. "A rather dramatic turn of phrase, wouldn't you say, Holmes?" Holmes retrieved the telegram, tapping it thoughtfully against his chin. "On the contrary, Watson, it is precisely the kind of phrase that piques my interest. Impossible is merely a term coined by those who lack the imagination to perceive the possible. A priceless artifact vanishing without trace, baffling the local constabulary in a land far removed from our familiar London fog, this promises to be a diversion of the most agreeable sort." He walked over to his substantial bookcase, retrieving a large, leather-bound atlas and a well-worn copy of a history of Portugal. His fingers traced the coastline, his mind already, I knew, connecting dots and deducing possibilities. Lisbon, he murmured, a city of hills and fado, of explorers and ancient mysteries. A splendid change of air, Watson, and a challenge to sharpen the dulled edge of our routine. For my part, I confess to a momentary sigh at the prospect of uprooting ourselves for yet another sudden journey abroad. My practice, my comfortable armchair, the very routine Holmes claimed to abhor, held a certain appeal. Yet, as I gazed at the animated face of my friend, sensing the revitalization that the mere hint of a complex puzzle brought him, a familiar thrill began to stir within me. The scent of adventure, the allure of the unknown, the joy of witnessing Holmes's unparalleled intellect at work, these were magnets I found myself utterly unable to resist. "Well, Holmes," I conceded with a smile, "if it is impossible, then it must indeed be something for you. When do we depart?" "As soon as humanly possible, Watson," he replied, already consulting a timetable, his eyes gleaming with a rekindled fire. "A packet steamer to the continent, then the express to Lisbon. We shall require our warmest travelling cloaks for the initial leg, but I dare say the Portuguese sun will soon banish the London chill from our bones. Pack your notebook, my dear fellow, and perhaps a small treatise on the art of illusion. One never knows what seemingly disparate threads may weave themselves into the tapestry of a case such as this." Within a remarkably short time, our arrangements were made. Holmes, with his indispensable travelling case of chemical apparatus, measuring tapes, and magnifying glasses, and I, with my medical kit and the eager anticipation of a new chapter for my chronicles, were soon jostling through the crowded streets of London, bound for the docks and a fresh mystery under the distant, sunnier skies of Portugal. Chapter 2: The Palacio and the Vanished Relic. Our journey to Lisbon was, for Holmes, a period of quiet absorption, punctuated by infrequent but pointed questions regarding Portuguese history, maritime exploration, and the peculiarities of Iberian society. For my part, I found myself drawn to the ever-changing vistas from the ship's deck, a welcome respite from the grey monotony of London. The air grew steadily warmer, the skies bluer, and by the time our vessel steamed into the broad estuary of the Tagus, a golden sun beat down upon a city of breathtaking beauty. Lisbon rose before us, a cascade of whitewashed buildings crowned with red roofs, tumbling down 7 hills towards the sparkling water. The air was alive with the clang of trams, the cries of street vendors, and the distant, haunting strains of what I would later learn was fado music. The scent was a heady mix of sea salt, roasting coffee, and exotic spices, a symphony for the senses utterly unlike anything I had ever experienced in England. "A truly magnificent city, Holmes," I remarked, feeling a lightness of spirit that had been absent for months. "Indeed, Watson," he replied, his gaze sweeping over the panorama with an almost detached analytical intensity. "A veritable laboratory of human activity, past and present. Note the strategic position, the legacy of empire evident in the architecture, the vibrant energy of its populace. Each detail a potential clue to the character of its inhabitants, and thereby, to the nature of their afflictions." We were met at the bustling docks by a liveried servant who, with minimal ceremony, ushered us into a handsomely appointed carriage. Our route wound through narrow, cobbled streets, past ancient churches and sun-dappled squares, before ascending one of the steeper hills. Eventually, we drew up before an imposing wrought-iron gate, beyond which lay a truly magnificent edifice, the Palacio de Estrella. It was a grand, 18th-century palace, its facade of creamy stone reflecting the afternoon sun, commanding an uninterrupted view across the city and the vast expanse of the Tagus. We were led through richly decorated halls, where ancestral portraits gazed down from gilded frames, and the air was thick with the scent of beeswax and old wood. In a spacious drawing room, bathed in the soft glow filtering through tall windows, we were formally presented to Lord Eduardo de Braganca. He was a man in his late 50s, impeccably dressed, with the refined features and aristocratic bearing one might expect of a Portuguese nobleman. Yet, despite his polished demeanor, a profound anxiety etched lines around his eyes, and his hand trembled almost imperceptibly as he gripped Holmes's in greeting. Beside him stood Madame Eleonora de Braganca, his wife. Younger than her husband, she possessed a striking, almost severe beauty, with dark, luminous eyes that held a certain veiled sorrow. She nodded a silent welcome, her gaze lingering on Holmes with an expression of mingled hope and skepticism. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," Lord Eduardo began, his voice hoarse with suppressed emotion, "I cannot adequately express my gratitude for your swift arrival. My family's, my honor, hangs by a thread." "Pray, compose yourself, Lord Eduardo," Holmes said, his voice calm and reassuring. "Let us have the facts. You spoke of a calamity of impossible nature. I find that impossibilities often resolve into simple, if obscure, realities when examined with sufficient care." Lord Eduardo gestured towards two plush armchairs, and we took our seats. "It was 3 nights ago," he recounted, his gaze drifting towards the empty pedestal in the corner of the room. "We had hosted a small, intimate gathering, a few close friends, a visiting dignitary. For their entertainment, we had engaged the services of a renowned French illusionist, known only as the Shadow. His reputation for seemingly defying the laws of physics is considerable. Indeed," Holmes interjected, "I recall a small mention of him in Le Monde some months ago. A master of misdirection, if I am not mistaken." "Precisely," Lord Eduardo continued, relieved that Holmes had some familiarity. His grand finale was a spectacular vanishing act. The salon was filled with light, smoke, and music. And it was during this performance, Mr. Holmes, that it happened. A priceless family heirloom. The Chronicle of the Navigator, an illuminated manuscript detailing the voyages of my ancestors, a treasure beyond monetary value, it simply vanished. He paused, taking a shaky breath. "It was displayed in that very case," he indicated a sturdy, glass-fronted cabinet, now conspicuously empty. Triple-locked, alarm-fitted, and under the watchful eye of a guard. The salon doors were locked from within for the performance. The windows secured. There was no sign of forced entry, no broken glass, no damaged locks. And yet, when the performance concluded, and the smoke cleared, the manuscript was gone. At this point, a new figure entered the room, a tall, impeccably uniformed man with a neatly trimmed moustache. "Inspector Fernando Silva, at your service, Mr. Holmes," he said, bowing politely. His English was excellent, though accented. "I am responsible for the local investigation, such as it is." "And what progress have you made, Inspector?" Holmes inquired, turning his piercing gaze upon the officer. Inspector Silver sighed, spreading his hands in a gesture of profound frustration. "None, I confess, Mr. Holmes. It is unprecedented. We have questioned every guest, every servant, the illusionist himself. Every corner of the palace has been searched. My men have gone over the scene with a fine-tooth comb. No tracks, no fingerprints belonging to an outsider, no disturbed dust. It is as if the manuscript simply dematerialized into thin air. Lord Eduardo speaks truly, it is an impossible crime." Holmes's eyes, which had been half closed in contemplation, now opened fully, gleaming with a barely suppressed excitement. He stood up and walked towards the empty display case, his lean figure casting a long shadow on the polished floor. He examined the locks, ran his gloved fingers over the glass, and then slowly surveyed the magnificent salon, his gaze missing nothing. "Impossible, Inspector!" Holmes murmured, a faint smile touching his lips. "A most intriguing word, indeed. Now, Lord Eduardo, if you please, I should like a complete and unvarnished account of that evening's performance. Every detail, however seemingly trivial, of the Shadow's act." Chapter 3: The Illusionist's Spectacle. The grand salon was, as I had observed, a room of considerable splendor, designed for opulent entertainment. Its high, vaulted ceiling was adorned with intricate frescoes, and its walls were hung with tapestries depicting scenes of ancient Portuguese victories. At one end, where the ill-fated performance had taken place, a temporary stage, still partially dismantled, stood against a backdrop of heavy crimson velvet drapes. In the center of the room, stark and accusing, was the empty display case, a testament to the perplexing disappearance. "Now, Lord Eduardo, Madame de Bragança," Holmes began, his voice cutting through the lingering tension in the room, "I require a full recounting of that evening. From the moment your guests began to arrive, to the regrettable discovery. No detail is too small, no observation too insignificant." Lord Eduardo, still visibly shaken, gestured to his wife. "Eleonora possesses a far keener memory for such social occasions, Mr. Holmes. I confess, my mind was preoccupied." Madame de Bragança, though reserved, spoke with a clear, precise articulation. "The evening proceeded much as any other private gathering, Mr. Holmes. Approximately 20 guests were present, diplomats, old family friends, and a visiting dignitary. Dinner was served, then conversation. The Shadow was scheduled to perform at 9 o'clock. And the manuscript?" Holmes prompted, his gaze fixed on the empty case. "It was placed in the display case precisely an hour before the performance," Lord Eduardo explained. "Our head butler, Antonio, oversaw the process personally. It is always locked, and the alarm set, whenever displayed. For the performance, the salon doors were secured from within, as is customary during such spectacles, to prevent disruption. The windows, too, were latched and shuttered." "And the guard?" Holmes asked. "A family retainer, old Manel," Madame Eleonora replied. "He stood by the case until the illusionist began his grand finale, at which point he was instructed to observe the stage, like all other guests. "Tell me about the Shadow's performance," Holmes requested. The sequence of his acts, the atmosphere, his final presentation. Madame de Braganca recounted a series of dazzling feats, coins vanishing and reappearing, handkerchiefs transforming into doves, a young woman levitating mid-air. He was truly captivating, Mr. Holmes. His manner was flamboyant, his movements fluid, his eyes intensely focused. He spoke French with a theatrical flourish, but his expressions were universally understood. And the finale? Holmes pressed. The act preceding the discovery of the theft. Lord Eduardo took over, a flicker of bewildered awe still in his eyes despite the preceding disaster. Ah, that was his masterpiece. He brought out a magnificent gilded cage, empty, and then, with a puff of smoke and a flash of light, a live dove appeared within it. He then announced his grandest trick, to make the cage, with the dove, vanish entirely from the stage. There was music, Madame de Braganca added, a crescendo of strings and brass. And then, he lowered a heavy velvet curtain across the stage. There was a moment of absolute silence, then a blinding flash of light, a loud bang like a cannon, and a sudden, dense cloud of smoke that billowed out across the stage and into the front rows of the audience. And when the smoke cleared, Holmes inquired, leaning forward. The curtain was drawn aside by the illusionist's assistant, Lord Eduardo concluded. The cage, the dove, all were gone. He bowed to thunderous applause. It was truly astonishing. It was only a moment later, as guests began to disperse and Antonio went to secure the manuscript for the night, that he let out a cry. The chronicle was gone. Holmes, who had listened with his eyes closed for much of the account, now opened them and turned his full attention to the salon. He moved with a quiet, almost predatory grace, beginning his meticulous examination. He went straight to the empty display case, peering into its depths, running his fingers along the inner edges, and inspecting the locking mechanism with a small lens. He then dropped to his knees, scrutinizing the polished parquet flooring for any telltale scuff marks or disturbed dust. He examined the wall behind the case, the velvet drapes, and the adjacent furniture. He moved to the temporary stage, still partially assembled. He ran his hand over the crimson velvet backdrop, feeling the texture. He knelt to inspect the floorboards beneath where the cage would have stood, examining the joints and any minute crevices. His eye swept across the ceiling, the chandeliers, and even the air vents. I watched him, as I always did, with a mixture of fascination and exasperation at the sheer minutiae he could extract from an apparently ordinary scene. "Inspector Silver," Holmes said, finally straightening up, his expression unreadable, "where is the Shadow now?" "He is confined to a suite within the palace, Mr. Holmes," the inspector replied. "We believed it prudent to keep him close, under watch. He is, naturally, distraught, claiming his art has been defiled and used for villainy." Chapter 4: The Art of Misdirection. The apartment where the Shadow was lodged was a lavish guest suite, but the illusionist himself seemed anything but comfortable. We found him pacing like a caged panther, his dark, expressive eyes flashing with a mixture of indignation and frustration. He was a man of theatrical proportions, with a lean, athletic build, a shock of dark hair, and hands that seemed perpetually poised, as if ready to conjure something from thin air. He was introduced to Holmes by Inspector Silver, who then withdrew, leaving us alone with the accused. "Monsieur Holmes," he began, his French accent thick and resonant, "this is an outrage. My name, my honor, my art, all dragged through the mud by this preposterous accusation. I, Jean-Pierre Du Bois, the Shadow, am an artist, not a common thief." "Pray compose yourself, Monsieur Du Bois," Holmes said, his voice calm, almost soothing. "I have no preconceived notions of your guilt. Indeed, it is precisely your art that interests me. The impossible disappearance of the Chronicle of the Navigator occurred during your final, most spectacular illusion. I merely wish to understand the mechanics of your craft, that I might better understand the canvas upon which this crime was painted." The illusionist, initially defensive, seemed momentarily taken aback by Holmes's unexpected approach. His shoulders relaxed slightly. "My craft, monsieur, is the art of misdirection," he explained, gesticulating subtly with his elegant hands. "It is the control of perception, the guiding of the eye, the manipulation of expectation. I make the audience see what I wish them to see, and not see what I wish to hide." "And your final act?" Holmes prompted. "The vanishing cage and dove." Du Bois brightened, perhaps relieved to speak of his art rather than his predicament. "Ah, le grand échappement. My masterpiece. It is a symphony of sensory experience, monsieur. The gilded cage, empty at first, then the appearance of the dove, a mere flick of the wrist, a hidden compartment, a swift exchange. But the vanishing of the cage itself, that is where the true artistry lies." He leaned forward, lowering his voice conspiratorially, as if sharing a trade secret. "The heavy velvet curtain, the dramatic music building to a climax. The sudden, blinding flash of magnesium powder, designed to temporarily overwhelm the optic nerve, to create a moment of genuine visual disorientation. Immediately following, the deafening boom, a small, controlled explosive charge, purely for dramatic effect, but also to create an auditory overload, a split second of confusion. And then, the voluminous smoke, released from hidden mechanisms beneath the stage, swirling, opaque, obscuring everything. A perfect storm." Then, Holmes mused, his eyes half closed. "A moment of collective blindness, both visual and auditory, shrouded in smoke. And it was within this precisely orchestrated chaos that the manuscript vanished from its case. But I was on stage, monsieur," Du Bois insisted, rising to his feet. "My hands were occupied with drawing the curtain, with operating the mechanisms for the flash and smoke. My attention was entirely upon the illusion. How could I have possibly left the stage, opened a triple-locked case, removed a heavy manuscript, and returned, all within those few seconds of dramatic effect?" "Indeed," Holmes said, almost to himself. "The question is not what you could have done, monsieur, but what another might have accomplished, utilizing the cover you unwittingly provided." He paused, then looked sharply at Du Bois. "Tell me, monsieur, during your preparations, did you make any adjustments to the stage, the lighting, or indeed, to the general layout of the salon?" "Only what was necessary for my apparatus," Du Bois replied. My assistant and I set up the stage. The palace butler, Monsieur Antonio, was most helpful, ensuring the power lines were accessible for my lights and that the heavy curtain rails were secure. And the specific timing of the flash and bang? Holmes asked, his tone casual, almost conversational. Were they always so precisely synchronized, so utterly simultaneous with the release of the smoke? Du Bois frowned slightly. Always, monsieur. It is critical for the effect. The flash disorients, the bang covers any minor mechanical sounds, and the smoke then renders the illusion complete, obscuring the brief moment the cage is lowered through a cleverly disguised trapdoor. A trapdoor, you say? I interjected, surprised. I saw no such thing. Ah, Dr. Watson, that is the beauty of it. Du Bois exclaimed, momentarily forgetting his predicament. It is so perfectly integrated into the stage, so flush with the floorboards, that it is utterly invisible. A masterpiece of carpentry, crafted for me in Paris. It drops the cage into a padded box beneath the stage, where my assistant secures the dove and prepares for the next show. Holmes merely nodded, but I noticed a flicker of deeper thought in his eyes. He asked a few more questions about the construction of the stage, the materials used for the smoke, and the exact position of the audience relative to the case. During this exchange, Holmes's gaze lingered on Du Bois's hands, which were remarkably unblemished for a man who claimed to handle machinery and magnesium flash powder. And the sound of the boom, Holmes pressed again, was it always a singular, sharp report, or did it perhaps have a more extended resonance on this particular evening? Du Bois hesitated, a faint line appearing between his brows. It is a loud sound, monsieur. Designed to be so. But I recall now. There was perhaps a slight echo, a reverberation that was a fraction of a second longer than usual. I attributed it to the acoustics of the Grand Salon, perhaps. An older building, the sound can bounce differently. Holmes said nothing more on the subject, but a subtle tightening of the muscles around his jaw told me he had found what he was looking for. The initial defensiveness of the shadowed had given way to an almost professional pride in explaining his craft, allowing Holmes to observe not just his words, but the subtle tells in his mannerisms, the fleeting uncertainties in his memory. We thanked Monsieur Du Bois and left him to his restless pacing, Holmes already deep in thought, his gaze fixed distantly on some unseen element. That subtle discrepancy, Watson, Holmes murmured as we walked down the grand staircase. The slightly longer reverberation of the boom. It may prove to be the key. Chapter 5, Unraveling the Threads. Back in the quiet solitude of our private sitting room at the Palacio, Holmes stood by the window, gazing out at the intricate patterns of the formal gardens below, his hands clasped behind his back. The earlier conversation with the shadow had clearly provided the critical link he sought, crystallizing his nebulous theories into a coherent hypothesis. Watson, he began, without turning, the impossible aspects of this case are, as ever, merely the froth on the surface of a far more mundane reality. Monsieur Du Bois, for all his theatrical flair, has unwittingly provided the perfect cover for a common, albeit cleverly executed, theft. I poured myself a glass of water, sensing a coming exposition. You believe, then, that the illusionist is innocent? Most assuredly, Holmes affirmed, finally turning to face me. His indignation was genuine, his pride in his art palpable. He is a showman, not a felon. No, the calamity of an impossible nature was simply a conventional crime, perfectly timed and executed during a moment of maximum sensory disruption, a moment designed by Du Bois to achieve an illusion, but unwittingly reproposed by another for an altogether different form of deception. He paced the room, his long strides carrying him from one end to the other. Consider the elements, the blinding flash, the deafening report, the billowing smoke, all calculated to overwhelm the senses and draw every eye and ear to the stage. For those crucial few seconds, the entire room was plunged into a state of semi-blindness and aural confusion. A master illusionist calls this misdirection. A master thief calls it opportunity. So, someone used his act. I pondered aloud. But who? And how, with the doors locked and the security so tight? The who is narrowing, Watson, Holmes replied, his eyes gleaming. The house must necessarily flow from the who. Let us dispense with the notion of an outsider. The locked doors, secured windows, and lack of forced entry all point inward. We are looking for someone with intimate knowledge of the palace's layout, its routines, its vulnerabilities, and, crucially, someone who had access to the salon both before the performance to prepare, and during the performance to act. His gaze sharpened. My attention is drawn to the staff. Lord Eduardo himself mentioned that Antonio, the head butler, oversaw the setup of Monsieur Du Bois's stage. This would have provided ample opportunity for subtle modifications or reconnaissance. A butler, Watson, is often privy to the secrets of the household, the comings and goings, the habits and peccadilloes of its residents. He is the silent orchestrator behind the scenes, observing all. But a butler? For a priceless artifact? I queried, struggling to reconcile the image of a dignified servant with that of a criminal mastermind. Motive, Watson, is often the most powerful propellant for desperate deeds. And desperate deeds often arise from desperate circumstances, Holmes countered. While Lord Eduardo and Madame de Braganca provided a meticulous account of the evening's entertainment, they naturally focused on the central event. My interest now turns to the periphery. Your assistance, my dear fellow, would be invaluable in this regard. You possess a certain amiable charm that often disarms those who might be reticent with me. Engage with the household staff. Observe their interactions, their loyalties. Inquire, with tact, about any recent changes in the household, any unusual occurrences, any personal difficulties among the long-serving members. I understood his meaning perfectly. While Holmes might elicit facts with surgical precision, I could often uncover the human element, the whispers and undercurrents that formed the emotional backdrop of a crime. Over the next few hours, I diligently applied myself to the task, engaging in seemingly casual conversations with various footmen, maids, and kitchen staff. The palace, despite its grandeur, possessed an extensive network of domestic gossip. It was from a particularly loquacious scullery maid, her tongue loosened by a generous tip and my sympathetic ear, that I gleaned a significant piece of information regarding Antonio, the head butler. She spoke of his impeccable service, his long tenure but also of a recent change in his disposition. "Always so precise, Dr. Watson," she confided, "but lately he has seemed distracted. And I heard one of the stable lads mention that Antonio had been seen at the cockfights more often, and looked quite grim after." A whisper, then, of gambling debts. A powerful, destructive motive, indeed. I made a mental note of this and returned to Holmes. Meanwhile, Holmes had not been idle. His inquiries had taken a different route, delving into the financial stability of the Braganca family itself. Through discreet observation of correspondence and a judicious examination of public records regarding land deeds and investments, details he could uncover with astonishing speed, even in a foreign land, he unearthed a concerning truth. Lord Eduardo, it appeared, was burdened by a substantial, undisclosed debt, threatening to unravel generations of accumulated wealth and reputation. This was not directly connected to the theft, but it added a layer of desperation to the family's situation, making the loss of the chronicle even more devastating and, perhaps, creating a dangerous climate within the household. Antonio, the butler, is reportedly under financial duress, Holmes, I reported, feeling a surge of satisfaction at my small contribution. Whispers of heavy gambling losses. Holmes nodded slowly, a glint in his eye. Excellent, Watson. The puzzle pieces begin to fit. A man under considerable financial pressure, with intimate knowledge of the palace's secrets, daily access to the very items stolen, and the perfect, ready-made cover of a theatrical spectacle. It is a compelling narrative, indeed. He walked back to the empty display case, his eyes narrowed. The illusionist described a perfectly integrated, flush trapdoor on his stage. What if that subtle discrepancy I noted in his account, the slightly longer reverberation of the boom, was not due to acoustics, but to the swift, precise action of a third party, masked by the illusion, making their move. A move facilitated by prior knowledge and preparation, perhaps even with a crudely fashioned key for this very case, used and discarded in the confusion. So, Antonio didn't just take the chronicle, Holmes? I asked, trying to keep pace with his rapid deductions. He used the Shadows Act as a shield. Precisely, Watson. He became the unseen accomplice, orchestrating his own act of disappearance, leveraging the illusionist's brilliant misdirection to serve his own desperate ends. The how is now clear. The who is all but confirmed. All that remains is to prove it. Chapter 6: The Unseen Accomplice. The following morning, Holmes requested Inspector Silva, Lord Eduardo, and Madame de Braganca to once again assemble in the Grand Salon. I sensed his intention was to conduct a practical demonstration, to strip away the theatrical flourish and expose the stark mechanics of the crime. The air was thick with expectation, punctuated only by the distant sounds of the city awakening. Inspector, Lord Eduardo, Madam, Holmes began, addressing them collectively. The initial impression of an impossible theft, orchestrated by some phantom agency, has now yielded to a more pedestrian, yet no less cunning, reality. The masterpiece of illusion presented by Monsieur Du Bois, while designed to delight, proved to be an even greater masterpiece of misdirection, unwittingly serving as the perfect veil for a very human crime. He walked over to the empty display case, indicating it with a sweep of his hand. We know that this case, containing the Chronicle of the Navigator, was triple-locked and alarm-fitted. We know the doors and windows of this salon were secured. We know Monsieur Du Bois was on stage, fully occupied with his performance. The logical conclusion, therefore, is that the thief was someone with intimate access, someone who understood the palace's vulnerabilities, and someone who could exploit a fleeting window of opportunity. Holmes then turned his attention to the stage area. Monsieur Du Bois described his grand finale, the flash, the deafening boom, and the billows of smoke. He also mentioned a subtle discrepancy, a slightly longer reverberation of the boom than usual, which he attributed to the salon's acoustics. I propose it was not acoustics, but rather the precise, rapid action of our culprit. He paused, letting his words sink in. The person who stole the manuscript was Antonio, the head butler. A collective gasp went through the room. Lord Eduardo's face blanched, and Madame de Braganca pressed a hand to her mouth. Inspector Silva, though surprised, retained his professional composure. "Antonio?" Lord Eduardo stammered, disbelief warring with sudden, dawning comprehension. "But he has served my family for 30 years. Loyalty, Lord Eduardo, can be a fragile thing when weighed against desperate circumstances," Holmes countered gently. "My inquiries, Dr. Watson's observations, and a subtle pattern of behavior all point to a man under severe financial strain, a fact not uncommon among those with access to the opportunities for a quick solution." "But how did he do it, Mr. Holmes?" Inspector Silva pressed. "Even with his knowledge, to breach a locked case and remove an item of that size during such a brief moment." Holmes gestured for us to follow him. He walked to the empty display case and pointed to a minute, almost imperceptible scratch on the wooden frame, just beneath the main lock. Antonio, with his intimate knowledge of the palace, knew the locking mechanism of this case better than anyone. He did not force it. He created a duplicate key. Not a perfect one, perhaps, but one sufficiently functional to open the lock with a little pressure. This scratch, almost invisible, is the result of that imperfect key, used with haste. He then moved towards the stage. During the setup of Monsieur Du Bois's apparatus, Antonio would have had ample opportunity. Not to interfere with the stage's mechanisms directly, but to prepare his own theft. He would have known the exact sequence of Du Bois's acts, the timing of the flash, the bang, the smoke. This allowed him to position himself perfectly. The longer reverberation Monsieur Du Bois noted was not an acoustic phenomenon, but the sound of Antonio, having unlocked the case in the darkness created by the flash, swiftly removing the chronicle. The momentary extra noise was the soft thud of the heavy manuscript being lifted from its felt lining, or perhaps a slight jostle against the case as he extracted it. The subsequent smoke provided the perfect visual blanket for him to perform the rest of his action. "But where did he put it?" I asked, picturing the butler, burdened with a valuable, bulky tome, moving discreetly in a room full of people. "Ah, Watson, that is where his intimate knowledge of the palace, and the illusionist's props, truly played a part." Monsieur Du Bois had a trapdoor beneath his stage, designed to receive the vanishing cage. Antonio did not use the trapdoor for the manuscript itself. Instead, he used his access during the setup to make a subtle, almost unnoticeable modification to the side of the stage structure itself, perhaps a loose panel, or a cleverly disguised hollow space within the framework of a decorative pillar near the stage. A place known only to him, easily accessible during the chaos of the illusion. Holmes knelt by the edge of the stage, examining a decorative wooden panel that appeared flush with the rest of the structure. He ran his hand along its edge, then pressed gently. With a barely audible click, a narrow, cleverly concealed gap appeared. Here, Holmes revealed, his finger pointing to a small, dark recess within the panel, a shallow cavity, perfectly sized to temporarily conceal a flat object like a book. During the smoke, Antonio would have simply slipped the manuscript into this prearranged hiding place, a matter of a second or two, utterly obscured from sight. He then replaced the chronicle not with air, but with a decoy. A cleverly weighted, similarly sized book, perhaps one from the palace library, wrapped to mimic the feel of the original, which he quickly placed back into the case after closing it, to briefly allay immediate suspicion if anyone looked directly. This allowed him to appear as surprised as everyone else when the real item was later discovered missing. Lord Eduardo slumped into a chair, his face a mixture of shock and betrayal. A decoy, and then he reported it stolen? The duplicity! Indeed, Holmes affirmed. His plan was likely to retrieve the true chronicle at a later, safer time, perhaps after the initial search had died down, and then dispose of it to an unscrupulous buyer to settle his gambling debts. The original was simply waiting in its temporary, hidden location, within arm's reach of the crime scene, until the coast was clear. Inspector Silver's eyes hardened. So, Antonio was not just the opportunist, he was the planner. The subtle scuff on the floor near the case, which my men dismissed as general wear, suddenly makes sense when paired with a fumbling, duplicate key. The slightly longer sound, the hidden panel, it all points to him. Precisely, Inspector, Holmes concluded. The illusionist created the perfect illusion. Antonio merely stepped into it, and used its momentary magic for his own, far more mundane, purposes. Chapter 7: The Grand Revelation. The stage was set, not for an illusionist spectacle, but for a far more compelling drama, the unmasking of a criminal. Holmes had arranged for a final, decisive gathering in the Grand Salon. Present were Lord Eduardo, his face etched with a mix of hope and profound apprehension, Madame Eleonora, her eyes fixed on Holmes with an intense, almost desperate expectation, Inspector Silver, his posture stiff with professional curiosity, and Monsieur Du Bois, the shadow, who, despite his previous indignation, now watched with a keen, analytical gaze, a fellow craftsman observing a master at work. And then, Antonio. The head butler stood slightly apart, his impeccably tailored uniform and stoic demeanor a stark contrast to the emotional current swirling in the room. He seemed a pillar of unwavering service, his hands clasped before him, his gaze politely neutral. Yet, I noticed a subtle tension in the set of his jaw, a barely perceptible clenching of his hands. Holmes surveyed the assembled company, his gaze lingering briefly on each face before settling on Antonio. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice clear and resonant, filling the vast salon. "We are here to conclude the distressing affair of the Chronicle of the Navigator. For days, this magnificent palace has been overshadowed by an impossible theft, one that baffled the most diligent of efforts." He gestured towards the empty display case. The disappearance occurred during a meticulously orchestrated illusion, a feat of misdirection so profound that it led many, including the local authorities, to believe in some supernatural agency. However, as I have always maintained, the seemingly impossible often yields to the rational when one peels back the layers of deception. He then turned to Monsieur Du Bois. "Monsieur Du Bois, your artistry created a perfect storm of sensory confusion. The blinding flash, the deafening report, the billows of smoke, all designed to focus attention, yet simultaneously to obscure. It was into this exquisite vacuum of perception that our true culprit stepped." Du Bois nodded, a look of growing understanding on his face. "The individual who stole the chronicle was not a shadowy figure from outside," Holmes continued, his voice gaining momentum, "nor was it the illusionist himself, whose movements were accounted for on stage. It was someone with intimate knowledge of this palace, its security, and its vulnerabilities. Someone who could prepare in advance, and act with precision during those critical moments of obscured vision and sound." He paused, then turned fully to Antonio. "That individual, Antonio, was you." The butler's composure fractured, if only for a split second. A muscle twitched in his jaw, and his eyes, for the first time, lost their polite neutrality, flickering with a mixture of shock and terror before quickly regaining their mask. Lord Eduardo rose halfway from his seat, his voice trembling. "Antonio! Is this true?" "Mr. Holmes makes wild accusations," Antonio said, his voice surprisingly steady, though a slight tremor in his hand betrayed him. "I have served this family faithfully for decades." "This is outrageous." "Outrageous, perhaps, but true," Holmes countered, his tone devoid of malice, yet unyielding. "Your financial difficulties, Antonio, particularly your recent gambling debts, created a powerful motive. And your position provided the perfect opportunity and knowledge." Holmes then stepped towards the display case, pulling from his waistcoat pocket a small, intricate key, not the official one. "This, Inspector," he said, handing it to Silver, "was found concealed beneath a loose floorboard in Antonio's pantry. A crude duplicate, fashioned with some care, but a duplicate nonetheless. The faint scratches on the frame of the display case, which I noted earlier, are consistent with the use of such an imperfect key, turned in haste." Inspector Silver examined the key, his expression grim. Furthermore, Holmes pressed on, moving towards the side of the stage. Antonio oversaw the setup of Monsieur Du Bois's apparatus. During this time, he made a subtle, personal modification. He exploited the very structure of the stage, creating a temporary hiding place for the stolen artifact. He tapped the decorative panel he had examined earlier. This panel, designed to look solid, is in fact a cleverly disguised recess. It clicks open with precise pressure. He demonstrated, and the panel, with a faint click, revealed a narrow, dark cavity within the stage's framework. It was empty now, but its purpose was clear. During those precious seconds of the illusionist's blinding flash, deafening bang, and enveloping smoke, Holmes explained, Antonio, positioned near the case, swiftly opened the lock with his duplicate key, retrieved the chronicle, and, using the perfect cover provided by Monsieur Du Bois, slipped it into this prepared cavity. The slightly longer reverberation of the boom, which Monsieur Du Bois attributed to acoustics, was in fact the subtle sound of a heavy tone being removed from its resting place, masked by the explosive report. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. He then replaced the True's Chronicles with a weighted decoy, a less valuable book he had procured, to temporarily allay suspicion. His plan, no doubt, was to retrieve the genuine manuscript after the initial furore had died down, and then sell it to settle his ruinous debts. Antonio, stripped of his last defences, his face ashen, finally broke. His carefully constructed mask crumbled, revealing a man broken by desperation. He sank to his knees, his hands covering his face. "It is true, my lord," he sobbed, his voice ragged. "The debts, they were insurmountable. I saw the illusionists act, the flash, the smoke, a perfect moment. I thought no one would ever know. I swear I meant no harm to the chronicle, only to sell it and reclaim my life. It was hidden in the old servant's locker, beneath the false bottom of my personal chest. I was waiting for the time to be right." Inspector Silva immediately dispatched 2 officers to the location Antonio indicated. Within minutes, they returned, bearing a wrapped, leather-bound volume. It was the Chronicle of the Navigator, retrieved, unharmed, from its ignoble hiding place. Lord Eduardo stared at the returned treasure, then at his kneeling butler, a complex mixture of relief, anger, and profound sadness on his face. Madame Eleonora let out a small, quiet sob of relief, pressing a hand to her husband's arm. Monsieur Du Bois, the shadow, stepped forward, a look of profound respect on his face. "Monsieur Holmes," he said, a genuine awe in his voice, "you, sir, are a true master of observation. You have revealed the truth behind the illusion, not by magic, but by logic. My name, my art, is cleared. I am forever in your debt." Holmes merely inclined his head. The case, once shrouded in the impenetrable fog of the impossible, was now laid bare. The genius of an illusionist had been unwittingly exploited, and the simple, human frailty of desperation had been revealed as the true architect of the crime. Antonio was led away by Inspector Silva, his once proud bearing utterly shattered. The ancient relic had returned to its rightful place, and with it, a semblance of peace began to return to the Palacio de Estrella. Chapter 8: Lisbon's Lingering Mysteries. The immediate aftermath of Antonio's confession was a maelstrom of emotion. Lord Eduardo, profoundly relieved to have his family heirloom returned, yet equally devastated by the betrayal of a long-serving retainer, struggled to reconcile his feelings. Madame Eleonora, her initial shock giving way to a quiet joy at the recovery of the invaluable manuscript, regarded Holmes with a profound and silent gratitude, a look that spoke volumes more than any effusive praise. Inspector Silva, his initial bafflement replaced by a professional admiration, oversaw Antonio's formal arrest and the meticulous documentation of the recovered artifact and Holmes's evidence. The illusionist, Monsieur Du Bois, approached Holmes with genuine reverence. "Monsieur Holmes," he said, extending a hand, "you have not merely solved a crime, you have illuminated the very principles of perception. My art relies on guiding the eye. Your intellect, it seems, guides the truth. My reputation, unfairly tarnished, has been restored by your unparalleled insight. Should you ever require an assistant in London, one who understands the nuances of misdirection, I am at your service." Holmes offered a rare, genuine smile and a firm handshake, acknowledging the unexpected camaraderie of two masters of observation, albeit in different fields. Lord Eduardo, having regained his composure, approached Holmes, a velvet pouch in his hand. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he began, his voice laden with sincerity, "my family, and indeed the history of Portugal, are deeply indebted to you. This is but a small token of our immeasurable gratitude." Holmes, with a polite wave of his hand, declined the offering. "My dear Lord Eduardo, the satisfaction of unraveling such an intricate knot, of perceiving the truth where others see only impossibility, is reward enough for me. The Chronicle has been restored to its rightful place, and justice, however painful for your household, has been served. That is the only payment I seek." Later that evening, as the city lights of Lisbon began to twinkle like scattered jewels across the hills, Holmes stood on the balcony of our suite, the mild Portuguese air a stark contrast to the London fog we had left behind. "It is a curious thing, Watson," he mused, without turning, "this fascination with the impossible. Human nature, in its infinite variety, will always present enigmas. But the truly perplexing cases are rarely those born of supernatural intervention, but rather those where the simplest motives are cloaked in the most elaborate deceptions." Antonio, for all his years of loyal service, succumbed to a very human weakness, I observed, consulting my notes. "A desperate gamble, a calculated risk under the cover of spectacle." "Precisely," Holmes replied. His intimate knowledge of the palace, coupled with the unique opportunity presented by Monsieur Du Bois's performance, transformed a man of routine into a cunning opportunist. The art of the illusionist, designed to bewilder and entertain, became the perfect, unwitting accomplice to a mundane, yet ingenious, theft. It is a testament to the power of misdirection, not just on the stage, but in the theatre of everyday life. I reflected on our adventure, on the vibrant colours and sounds of Lisbon, so different from our usual backdrop of foggy London streets. The charm of the city, the warmth of its people, and the thrill of the chase had all combined to make this a memorable chapter in our chronicles. Holmes, despite the exotic setting, remained the constant, his intellect cutting through cultural differences and local peculiarities to grasp the universal truths of human behavior. Even amidst the sun-drenched beauty of Portugal, the fundamental elements of human villainy and ingenuity remained unchanged, awaiting the keen eye of my remarkable friend. The following morning, with the Chronicle safely returned to its heavily reinforced display, and Antonio awaiting justice, we prepared for our journey home. Our carriage took us once more through the bustling streets, past the ancient cathedral and the melancholic strains of a fado singer, a poignant farewell to a city that had briefly held us in its thrall. As our vessel pulled away from the Lisbon docks, the city receding into a picturesque memory, Holmes stood at the rail, his gaze fixed on the horizon, already lost in thought. I knew his mind, ever restless, was not dwelling on the case concluded, but perhaps contemplating the next impossible the challenge that awaited him, somewhere, in the ceaseless tapestry of human existence. The London fog and its peculiar mysteries would soon reclaim us.